Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it may be for you. This is David Howard of LeTourneau University and teaching the United States history up to 1865 course. Been great to be with you this semester, and today for our last week of interactive assessment, I want to provide us a little video with something we call historiography. Historiography is basically how do we remember history? How do historians write about history? And so this week, I think it's very opportunistic for us to be able to look at this, because as we finish the Civil War, this is basically where the writing of professional history begins. And so I want us to take an opportunity to look at that as we can. So this is going to be the foundation and the basis for our interactive assessment this week. And so take a few minutes to listen to this video, to watch this video. It has a PowerPoint with it. Work through the PowerPoint. I'm going to attach the PowerPoint as well, so you can look at the PowerPoint without having to go back to the video. All right. I'll try to be brief. The video will probably be somewhere around 30 minutes. Okay. So anyway, look forward to the discussion afterwards. I think this is a great topic, a good way for us to kind of wrap up some of our ideas about history. How do we remember things? Why is that important for our society? All right. So as we do that, let's kind of take a look at this. And so one of the things about history I think is important is this idea of background and foreground. In the background of a picture, we get the context of what all of this happening all out here in the front. And if people are driving by in a carriage, if people are driving by in a carriage, if it's in a city or something like that, then that's fine. It gives it a different context if it's out in the country or out by a scenic view of a lake or something like that, or whether it's in a war-torn area. So writing, reading, discussing, and interpreting the history of the American South. And I kind of like to think of this idea of things that are happening in the background and things that happen in the foreground. Mostly, historians have done a great job with the foreground. Who are the key people? Who are the big people? Who are the event changers? What events changed our society and culture? And we do a great job with the foreground. But history, we see shifts from the foreground images to the background and some other things that give us greater definition and understanding of history. So how will America remember the Civil War? Basically is kind of our question for today. Well, there's the northern, and right after the war, of course, you're going to get two perspectives on memory, right? I don't know about you, but if you've ever had a dispute with somebody's going to remember one thing one way and somebody else is going to remember it another way. So in the Union Northern perspective, you see, the discussion that the Republicans were the ones that defended the Union by preventing the spread of slavery into the West, Lincoln and the Republican Party. Not so much for slaves, but more about they prevented the spread of slavery. Well, they also would say that slavery and free labor undermined the industrial advancement and the industrial revolution that had been enjoyed by many in the North and the Northeast, and part of this wage labor economy of the nation. Plantation owners were guilty. They viewed plantation owners as guilty of imposing a feudalistic, backward way of life. In fact, they would say, the northern view would say that the South was socially and economically and intellectually backward. Kind of viewed it as this foreign country, kind of this third world country to go and to be visited and kind of talked about, but not really. So that's kind of their perspective. They would view the South, the Southern role in the war, as overreaching their political power, and they launched this ill-advised attack against the Constitution in order to defend an unjust and unwise way of life. Well, naturally, the Confederates, the South, has a different view on things. they defended their way of life from the aggressive industrialists and these federalists, and why they would argue states' rights. The Union was arguing about the federal union of the country. They would see slavery as a necessary system that enhanced the economy of the nation, and they were in collusion with the northern bankers and the cotton agents. All these people, the financial system was in the North, and so the slave economy was in partnership with these institutions there in the North. Slavery had morphed into this benevolent, kind of paternalistic system that benefited the slave by introducing Christianity and Western culture to an inferior race that would not have experienced it otherwise. And so they also viewed the defeat in the Civil War as a lost cause. They fought bravely and stood and to defend their Southern way of life. And they minimized the role of slavery, saying, it's over states' rights and freedom and this type of thing is why the Civil War was fought. So with these views in mind, the original school of history, the original professional history didn't occur until this time. This is when professional academic history begins. And so it basically, they're going to try to understand Reconstruction and the Civil War, and this begins somewhere around the 20th century, around the turn of the 20th century, okay? So about a generation after all of these events. And so now, how are we going to remember these academically, all right? So what do they want to do? First, they want to interpret what was, the American South before the Civil War. What was it, a distinct region, or why were they distinct, and, was it even different than the North? And so they're going to debate that. They also want to identify the cause and effects of the Civil War. Why did the Civil War begin? And then they also want to interpret Reconstruction after the Civil War. Was it Southern victimization? They were being victimized by the North after a victory, and the North imposed what the Southerners would call black rule on them, or was the North, was it that they were trying to reconstruct Southern society in a model of the Northern, what they would perceive as more progressive Northern perspective. So anyway, here's the different phases of the writing that occur from the 1900s to the 1930s. The Dunning School and the Progressive School exist, and then we get revisionism, and then we go into the post-civil rights, and then class consciousness. And I'm going to review each one of those in a little bit more detail. First one is a little bit theatrical here with the moving of the curtains. You might know of Gone with the Wind. Well, the Dunning School is basically the historical basis for Gone with the Wind. It portrays the South as victims of Union aggression. The Union imposes this military occupation. So Scarlett O'Hara in the novel and the movie Gone with the Wind is this benevolent character. She's this sympathetic character. She is strong and she's feisty, and she's going to defend her way of life. And these Union forces are taking away her plantation, taking away her and upsetting her slaves that are loyal to her, not to the Union. And so you see this, and that's kind of what's written, and kind of the view. The Dunning School kind of mollifies the brutality of slavery. In fact, it kind of says that slaves were a little bit infantile, and they were a little bit incapable, and they really need the direction and the stability of the plantation class or slave owners or the white society to kind of really help them along. And so African American slaves were better off for having gone through the experience of slavery. This is the Dunning School, all right? Not saying I'm not portraying myself as thinking this at all, but this is a view of history that was valid at the time. It depicted African Americans as intellectually inferior, infantile, and as a deficient race, inherently deficient as a race. Why did this view even succeed? I mean, it sounds repulsive, right? But why does it succeed? Well, number one, whites in the nation the majority race at the time, the dominant race at the time, and so they needed to reunite. But they also depend on this school of social Darwinism that basically says that, Darwin talks about the survival of the fittest, and so when you apply Darwin's theory to sociology and social class, then basically what is said is that social Darwinism at the time said basically that because African Americans are an inferior race, it's going to be a matter of a generation or two before the entire race dissipates and kind of disappears and fades into the dominant white culture. So that's the mentality that was going on at the time. Examples of this are William Archibald Dunning, and these guys are at Columbia University. This is not a out of the way. This isn't some kind of alt-right type of thing. This is mainstream academic history. All right. The typical opponent, the main one was W.E. Du Bois, who writes in the 1930s, and he begins to contend with this view of history. He's a lone voice. People don't hear him, don't listen to him, because he's an African American historian, sociologist, and his voice isn't heard because of racial concerns. Now, still in the 20s and 30s, it shifts a little bit, and instead of Andrew Johnson being this horrible president, now the progressives come in and say what we call, what is called progressive at the time, is that Andrew Johnson, his plan to reconstruct the South was really to protect the Constitution and civil freedoms and states' rights for Southerners. He's idealized, he was impeached, but he's idealized as a man of great integrity. He viewed Republicans, the progressive school also views Republicans as radicals. These Republicans that were trying to get civil liberties and voting rights and citizenship for African Americans and freed slaves, that they were viewed as radical, and so it still has a very conservative, very negative view on towards Republicans who were seen as anybody that favored black social and political equality, and so they were viewed, the Republicans were viewed as these economic opportunists, and for the northern industrialists, as that's what they were doing. They're just taking advantage of the black culture for northern industrialism, which may not be too far from the truth in some ways. I do think there was some opportunism there, but it still portrayed the South as victims of Northern aggression. Now it begins to shatter a little bit with revisionism in the 1940s and 1950s. Revisionism that's a word in history that a lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh, that's revisionist history. That's rewriting of history." And this is why, right here, is because the revisionist historians now take the Dunning thesis and say, and Howard K. Beale, who challenges anything from the Dunning school, and now says, here's what he says: historians must purge their writings of racial and social justifications for denying political, social, and economic rights to African Americans. So he challenges every bit of the Dunning school and says, historians, come on, we got to stop this. We got to stop justifying this oppressive treatment for African Americans and other people of color. And so Beale who is a renowned historian, and he ends up being the press secretary for President Roosevelt during World War II. So he's a well-known individual, and so his article, just a little article, scholarly article, really begins to turn the historical community on its ear. So now the pendulum swings from the Dunning School now back to a different perspective. Du Bois had already followed his lead. Beale begins to write this work, and so these revisionists begin to crack the foundation a little bit, and so to unveil this a little bit and think about it, W.E. Du Bois, his article, or his book, very, very scholarly work, very good work. He talks about Black Reconstruction, and in his wonderful work, Souls of Black Folks, he talks about what's behind the veil, and that there's this shroud of a veil that separates white and black culture, and in the black culture behind the veil, that there's a different conversation that takes place on that side of the veil than when at the time it was for self-preservation. If blacks talked one way in white society, their life was in danger. And so he talks about this different dialogue, different conversation that takes place on one side of the veil and the other. And so his work about Reconstruction, he talks about Reconstruction as a period that made some strides in constructing racial and political equality. He's the first one to point out the elevation of many black leaders into political office and the voting rights that many received initially before they were retracted by the Redeemers later on. He talks about the Union military forces, and when the Union military forces retreat, then these recalcitrant Southern Redeemers revoke any progress and institute Jim Crow laws about segregation in public space, segregation of schools, segregation of marriage, violation of voting rights, all of these types of things, disenfranchisement. So all of these things that occurred in the South, he says, really kind of began here with this post-Reconstruction era. He criticized the Dunning School authors for failing to include the highly valuable testimony of freed black slaves, former slaves. And this actually, his work in the 1930s actually prompts FDR to begin to collect to have historians collect these testimonies. And so now we have these testimonies from slaves because of, Du Bois kind of prompting this. And so it's a pretty good thing that we have these, the slave testimonies in the Library of Congress and in universities around the country. He was ignored, though. Many historians ignored him because he was African American. Now, another revisionist, though, that was not ignored is Kenneth Stamp. His great work here, The Causes of the Civil War, 26 scholarly articles, all in a collection to dissect the causes of the Civil War. What was the cause of the war? Was it Northern aggression, or was it Southern, fight for states' rights? So that's that's where he gets into all that. He has another work here on slavery and what was slavery? What was it really like in slavery? And he uses, social demography. He doesn't use testimonies and journals and that type of stuff. He really uses, what he uses is sociological research to look at the different aspects of slavery and and the peculiarities of it and the nuance of it a little bit. So he sees it not as this benevolent, paternalistic kind of thing, but he begins to see the brutality of slavery, and he begins to shape that in a way that, and how he kind of goes a little bit overboard with, kind of gets into this idea that slaves were so oppressed and so beaten down that they don't really have a lot of agency, a lot of willpower, a lot of identity. And then he also has another, his other work is on Reconstruction, and begins to look at Reconstruction and Reconstruction from the point of view that there were some significant changes that occurred before, and he would agree with Du Bois on this, that significant changes occurred until the Redeemers came in and took it away. So you get this revisionism versus the Dunning School. We've kind of talked about this in both cases. This is a great summary slide for you to kind of go back and kind of take a look at. So basically, though, what is set up now at this time is this revisionist versus Dunning. So the Dunning thesis doesn't just die out just because the revisionists come along. There's still, at the time in the 40s and the 50s, this fight against, you get this progressive versus conservative view of history. And so it is an us versus them now. So we get back to this North versus South kind of thing, black versus white, us versus them, this dichotomy and view of history. And so we try to throw that away, but it's not done very easily, because Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he worked for the Department of Labor, and he becomes a senator. He was well known, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You can look him up. He was an ambassador. He was considered an intellectual. Well, he's working in the Department of Labor when under JFK, when JFK is assassinated, and then Johnson becomes president. And so he's in the Department of Labor under Johnson. He doesn't like Johnson's war on poverty that is helping underprivileged children in schools, Head Start programs, educational programs, and traditional welfare programs. He doesn't like these, and so he takes it upon himself to write this report. And this report basically infers that black are intellectually inferior, and that that basically he doesn't accept the idea that cultural bias and racism in standardized tests affected low scores in the segregated black schools, and so he rejects that. He would also say that black fathers had been so ruined by the effects of slavery that they needed government help. He talks about the strong black, matriarch, the strong black mother in the urban setting, and that the absentee father problem that accelerates during the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the African American community. And so he says that basically that the black fathers have been so ruined by by slavery and by black culture that they really need the help of white government to come in and prop them up so they can achieve and perform at middle class standards. Well, very condescending, very degrading view of the black male. Well, opponents such as the NAACP also, they go, they don't like this, of course, and so they begin to contend with it. And they don't like the idea that he says that, Moynihan says that the black community was genetically flawed by crime and pathological behavior. So a very, very condescending view of African American culture, and especially in the urban setting. So it is thought this article is thought to have created a political opportunity to blame blacks for their own problems. You still hear these ideas spoken of actually in our communities a great bit as just conversations. It kind of has become ingrained in some parts of society. Well, after the Civil Rights, some things changed. After the Civil Rights, now historians are able to begin to write and not be bound by having to have a particular allegiance to the North or to the South or to black or white perspective or something like that. And they begin to question every aspect of society, of American South or American society, all the way back. And I put in 1619, that's the first time slaves were imported into America. So both the traditional view and the revisionist view identify Reconstruction as this pivotal point. But the post-civil rights historians argue that nothing changed during Reconstruction. All right, and so they would say that really this is just a period of progression of the South, and joining the rest of the nation. This is kind of part of the maturation of the nation, maturation process. It's this continuity. And that Reconstruction wasn't this chaotic moment in time. It just, yes, there was a lot of things that happened, but nothing really changed except staying the course, moving ahead. But then the conservative Reconstruction was part of this continuous social progress. Is kind of moving, but not getting, society is changing and progressing, but not getting ahead of itself. And so that's kind of the view that they began to take. A few examples here. Number one, and these are not bad histories. I'm not denouncing any of this as far as these post-civil rights historians. C. Van Woodward actually is probably one of the most insightful historians into what makes up the mind of the South. He gets into what made up the mind of the South up through his time period in the 60s and the 70s when he was writing. And he says that the Redeemers, it wasn't slavery so much that caused the racial animosity of the day, but it was more the Redeemers and the post-Reconstruction period of coming back and revoking civil liberties and segregating, and that is where really the deep-seated racial animosity occurred. Fascinating work there. Roll Jordan Roll by Eugene Genovese depicts slavery as this relationship, paternal relationship, where plantation owners relied on slaves and slaves relied on the plantation owners, all right, or slave owners, that the slave owner was their first wave of defense, that, in whatever problems may occur. Genovese, he does a great job viewing the development of Christianity in the slave culture, and why slaves adopted Christianity in large numbers, and it was the idea that they could be a Christian and know that they have another master, not the master that they had to serve here on earth, but they had a master in heaven, and that it kind of softened their revolutionary kind of their revolutionary passion that might develop when, for an oppressed people. And that's important because Genovese was a Marxist. Karl Marx has the idea of history that, oppressed people will revolt, and oppressed people will revolt, and then, they get into power, and then there's this cycle of oppressed people and revolution, and ultimately we're going to reach this utopia of, and so he has this, it's an interesting contribution. He kind of gets a little bit of flack as because of his Marxist views, and so, but he has a valuable contribution to the field of Southern history. And then here's one: Herbert Gutman challenges the Moynihan thesis about the broken African American family. And he takes a look and goes into individual plantations around the South, goes into their actual records of marriage and family, and he goes into these records of these different plantations, and he concludes that the slave family was as stable as the white family in marriage and divorce and raising their children as the white families at the time. So the slave family was as stable as white families at the time, and he does this through sociological research and history, and so it's a fascinating work there. and important work. Now, so you beginning to get these different views and more sympathetic views to other people in here. But then after, it kind of goes into a different phase in the 1990s to the present. And basically what happens is we begin to recognize the value of ambiguity and nuance in the history from authentic voices of various races, different classes, different economic classes. Poor whites in the South were a larger number, but we've never heard their story before until some of these new historians that are aware of class consciousness. And then, gender concerns and, new studies from the LGBT community and kind of a view of what was going on at different periods of time as well. So these different perspectives, different voices we begin to hear. These historians understand the foreground events of key people and big events, but they include the context and the background and kind of what's going on and what are these big people and big events of the story going on. What's the setting and the background? And so they take a look at that ambiguity and the nuance of all of this. They also bring up questions about American exceptionalism, and that America is this exceptional country, this light on the hill, the city on the hill kind of thing that that is part of the American fabric, but they will question this traditional narrative of economic opportunity and political opportunity for all by pointing out, wait a minute, there was political opportunity and economic opportunity for many, but what about people of color? What about immigrants? What about the Irish? What about the Catholics? What about other groups? What about other groups that have suffered and endured oppression because of this view of exceptionalism? And so they will raise these questions, and they have some intriguing kind of responses. They include more descriptive portrayals of the triumphs and the trials of women and people of color and economically disadvantaged. And they make some very valid and important connections with America in the broader global community. Here are some quick examples of them. Stephanie McCurry. Here, defeat of the Confederacy. She says basically the defeat of the Confederacy was not the overpowering military dominance of the North, but it was really the internal weakness of the Confederacy, and their weakness was inherent and genetic and organic. And so it wasn't because of the external pressure, it was because of the weakness of their ideas and their ability to coordinate and work together as a nation. So she talks about that. She does a great job there. Next, Ruined Nation by Megan Kate Nelson. Fascinating book. It looks at the physical objects of war, the environment, how the environment was affected. Has a great chapter on trees and how trees, the forts, they didn't have forts all over the place, but anytime there was a battle that was going to take place, there were the camps. This was a very mobile war, and anything you read about Civil War history, how mobile that it was, and all these, they built roads because of the tropical nature of the South and the rainfall, and so they needed roads built so they could get weapons and material around, and so they depended on these trees. But then also a lot of the battles took place in forest. With the cannon and the shots, the rifle shots. So and they needed all of these, of course, all of the camps, all of the fires and the cooking that was needed, all the tools and implements, all of that. And she gets into this whole thing too about memorials and how, these, like for instance, this picture here, it shows a structure that was taken. Well, that picture was taken of a building that was destroyed in a battle, and America would go in and clean that off. They would just totally demolish that and then rebuild, rather than preserving a ruin like the Parthenon or something in Greek or Roman society or something like that. Another example here is Jim Downs' Sick from Freedom. This was about illness and suffering after the Civil War. There's a reason why freed slaves were called contraband. They were called contraband because the Union did not want to treat them as prisoners of war. If they were prisoners of war, then that said they had done something wrong, but they didn't treat them as refugees, because then that would have held the Union to a different level of treatment. So they called them contraband. They were property. That's what slaves were called by the South. They were called their property. And so when slaves escaped behind the Union lines, as those Union forces came in and conquered different regions of the South, and those slaves in those conquered regions would get behind the Union lines, and they were hoping to find a lot of freedom. But what they found was they were treated poorly. They were not given appropriate clothing, housing, food, jobs. In fact, they were treated much like they were under, if not worse, in many conditions than when they were slaves. They were forced to grow crops for the Union. They would build the camps for the Union. They endured exposure to the environment. Only well-bodied, able men were given the best treatment. Women and children would often die because of exposure to the environment. They endured illness and treatment of smallpox and yellow fever. Were not treated, were not given proper medical attention, even the medical attention that was available at the day. So it's an interesting work. And this is a history. These are all three histories that would not have been written decades before because of the way that it's written. Last three examples here. One is Hannah Rosen, talks about the issue of race and gender, and kind of this view that, at the time, whites were afraid that that black men were going to come in and rape their women, that, black men were much more of a sexual being than the kind of brutalistic, kind of beastie, type of kind of a brute in as far as sex is concerned. And so the issue, though, is that was a fear that was perpetrated. That was said. But the truth of the matter is that when you look at history, that black women were in much more jeopardy of being raped by white men than the reverse. And so she gets into how that story is flipped and why it is flipped, and the role that white women are given the role of protecting the race, with their sexual purity and that type of thing. And so the role of protecting the race is given to white women. And so it's a fascinating, interesting work there. Next is Edward Bloom about W.E. Du Bois and the reforging of the white republic, and he takes race and religion and sees how race and religion merge together to reunite the white North and South, where they kind of say, okay, we fought, sorry, but we both fought bravely and courageously. Let's don't debate the issues anymore. And so he writes about how whites and blacks in the 1880s and 90s and 1900, this is when Memorial Day becomes a popular thing, is because Union and Confederate soldiers would go to the battlefield and recount their fighting of the battles and say that we both fought bravely and that type of thing. And so this reuniting of the white race, North and South, after the war, of course, at the expense of people of color, African Americans primarily. And so this is an interesting and important work here. And then this last one is Soul by Soul, Walter Johnson. Incredible story of how he goes into and he looks at he looks at people who buy slaves, people who sell slaves, the auctioneers, and then he takes a look at slaves, and he takes a look at them from an economic perspective. And basically he talks about how an individual, for instance, a particular attitude, a particular look, a particular, if it's, bone structure, teeth, physical structure, these types of things, how these human qualities, or whether it's ability to communicate, ability to think, how these human qualities are turned into a commodity and actually affect the price of the slave. But then he also looks at it and says, okay, and he doesn't look at slaves as weak, ignorant participants in this situation. He views slaves, and he's able to demonstrate how slaves, although they were being oppressed and sold as products and commodities, they demonstrate their free will and their agency by being able to shape the sale. They could act a particular way, they could sulk, they could be flamboyant, they could be aggressive, they could act either smart, or they could act less intelligent, and they could affect the deal that's being made between the auctioneer and the plantation or the slave owner that's buying the slave. And so he talks about how he writes about how slaves could have some effect in the deal, but it's a very interesting, very physical, material culture study, and it gets into the capitalistic role in capitalism as a whole, and it is very interesting. And he talks about how slavery was a very profitable system, and so interesting work there by him. Now, so this is the topic of our interactive assessment. So as we look at this, here are 3 questions for the week. In what ways has the writing of history of the South changed over time? Okay? How is the writing about the South, about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, about slavery, how has that changed over time? I'm going to post this, and so you can relook at the PowerPoint. You could do a little bit of research on your own too. All right, so that's one question. Why is the writing of history that includes nuance and ambiguity important to our present situation? What do I mean by our present situation? I mean our present social American situation, our society today. All right, we're no doubt we are in a contentious time right now, politically, racially, economically. There's a lot of ideas floating around, a lot of kind of angst and unrest floating around society. So why is the writing of history that includes nuance and ambiguity important to our situation today? And then lastly, I hold Christians to a higher standard. How can Christians include various historical perspectives and communicate Christian values when discussing issues of race, class, and gender in society? So I think when Christians discuss things in society, we ought to be held to a high moral standard. We ought to be held to a high intellectual standard too. And so how can we bring in both Christian values and intellectual perspectives? So those are our questions of the week. Y'all have done a great job on the questions so far this semester. I'm looking forward to some great answers. And so anyway, so I'm looking forward to some great responses and some great interaction this week. I've thoroughly enjoyed being with you this semester, and I look forward to helping you and being with you any way I can in the future. All right, let me know if I can be any assistance to you. All right, thank you.